Hello, welcome back. This is the second video in a two-part series titled Feminist Criminology. In the first video, we took a fairly comprehensive overview of a typical feminist criminologist, Dr. Jane Monckton Smith. In this video, we will take a look at the real-world consequences that flow from unthinking acceptance of what is essentially the product of feminist theory. Now, before we dive into this particular rabbit hole, I just want to say that this can appear an extremely complex subject, which is awash with 4 and even 5-letter acronyms. We have our darts and dash methodologies, we have the Duluth Model, as well as some pretty impenetrable jargon and the usual facile buzzwords thrown in for good measure. But let's not be put off by this apparent complexity. What I would like us to consider in this video are the general principles on which such models and methodologies are founded. Because by looking at these general principles, I think we can begin to identify, define, and understand what lay at the core of these theories. So let's dive into the whole and try and make sense of what we see. First, we will consider the Duluth Model. This model relates to domestic violence. The Duluth Model is perhaps the most prominent and widely used model for articulating all stages of abuse, and it is named after Duluth, Minnesota, the city where it was first developed. I think the most surprising fact that might make any reasonable person pause for reflection is the tiny sample size of the population used to establish the model. The program, conducted in Duluth in 1981, used a sample population of 5 women and 4 men, and this extremely small population in Minnesota was the basis for a model that has been rolled out internationally and adopted uncritically by law enforcement and governments worldwide. It forms a critical part of police response and investigation of alleged domestic violence. But the model itself is based on feminist theory. It assumes that the abuser is always male and the victim is always female. This is despite the fact that research has exhaustively and conclusively proven that violent behaviour is not a gendered issue, but rather a generational issue. Most studies have concluded that both genders are equally as capable of domestic or intimate partner violence. The next thing that might be of concern would be the qualifications of the practitioners responsible for establishing the model in the first place. At the time the model was developed, the activists responsible had no qualifications in psychology, no experience in therapy, and established their operating principles on a sample size of no more than 9 people. The product of their efforts could be fairly described as an ideological position mapped to a real-world intervention. And this model has been adopted by US law enforcement and the Home Office in the United Kingdom as the basis of pro-arrest policies formulated as a response to domestic abuse. And this pro-arrest stance rests almost entirely on unproven and poorly evidenced feminist research. Such feminist theories are easy to summarize. It is always men's fault, everything, no exception. The consequences of this worldview is, of course, that women are never at fault. Women only aggress in defence. They never murder their children. They only kill their spouse in self-defence. Feminist theory, at its core, is an obviously sexist ideology. This sexism is often displayed undisguised, but is hardly ever challenged. If we look at the Duluth power and violence wheel, it is always she portrayed as the victim, in every situation and every category. It was so obviously biased, it became an embarrassment. So that today, at least in the UK, the same power wheel has been amended to include her, him. But the model is so entrenched in feminist ideology that it was not possible to disguise its founding dogma. And the section titled Male Privilege still sits on the wheel, fossilized as a reminder of the model's ideological origin. Let's turn now to Monckton Smith and the DART methodology, yet another product of feminist theory. An article on the PPSS website describes the DART methodology in these words, and I quote, "It might sound like an exercise in time travel or the plot of the Tom Cruise sci-fi movie Minority Report, but this is no fantasy. Well, It seems that PPSS are quite happy to compare their methodology with the film Minority Report. Indeed, they appear proud in declaring the similarities between their own efforts and the system of pre-crime portrayed in the movie, which is somewhat ironic because I doubt the good doctor could have seen the film, or if she had, she certainly didn't grasp the plot, because Minority Report was about a seriously flawed system. This flaw is what gives the film its title Minority Report. The fact that future predictions are less than perfect has to be kept secret, as it could damage the system's credibility. This is the main theme of the film, that believing one can predict the future with certainty is both foolish and dangerous. Ironic, isn't it? But fantasy it is not. The Dart model is already being adopted by police departments, and unlike the film, where future criminals are confined to a happy virtual reality, the real-world victims of such a system face a more dystopian future. They lose access to children, they can lose employment and their home. They are categorized as abusers by social services and have a good chance of being unfairly charged and convicted by law enforcement. The first point I would like us to consider in relation to the Dart methodology is the confidence expressed by people like Monckton Smith in their own system. Indeed, the certainty of their own conclusions is striking. For example, on the PPSS website it states the following, and I quote, "We believe fundamentally that behaviour can be predicted, and therefore we should be assessing threat to life." So let's review that statement. The claim is quite simple. They believe that past behaviour predicts future action. Now this at first reading may seem fairly intuitive. It seems to make sense. But without a series of caveats, this intuitive statement is simply misleading. It is a contentious statement. It's a somewhat simplistic maxim. If you were to read The Complete Idiot's Guide to Psychology, you would see the exact same maxim. But this is a gross simplification. And in the case of risk assessment, it is likely to lead to many false positives and almost certain to leave real abusers in place. Most psychological scientists who study human behaviour agree that past behaviour could be a useful marker for future behaviour, but only under certain specific conditions. But we are faced, when considering the work of Monckton Smith, with simplistic thinking incorporated in a forensic context. This is deeply concerning, particularly given the biases inherent in any theoretical framework derived from feminist theory, where any statistical baseline is necessarily incomplete, because we have a proven tendency towards ignoring or discounting a large percentage of victims, i.e. males, from our considerations. This past behaviour predicts future action mantra fits well with dominant feminist theory, and it's an easy sell thanks to the Duluth Model. The male has become viewed as a ticking time bomb, a potential abuser, and a possible killer. So males are considered only as a set of risk factors. What this view doesn't fit so well with, though, is reality itself. So the Dart methodology promoted by PPSS and Monckton Smith appears to be an attempt to take a fairly complex diagnostic process and distill it to a checkbox exercise for use by investigating police and other professionals. It is based on a simple triad, and triads for some reason appear quite fashionable in some psychological circles, particularly those with a copy of Idiot's Guide to Psychology on their bookshelf. But this triad model is not a new innovation. So where does this idea that the best predictor of future behaviour is past behaviour come from? It was first proposed in 1963 by the psychiatrist J. Macdonald in his paper The Threat to Kill. It became known as the Macdonald Triad, also known as the Homicidal Triad. The model was relatively simple. He proposed 3 key childhood behavioural markers: cruelty to animals, obsession with fire setting, and persistent bedwetting. It was sometimes referred to as the Triad of Evil, but I'm pretty sure that most of you will have picked up an obvious flaw already, in that bedwetting is fairly common in childhood. So should we really place any significance on such a common behaviour? But we also have the issue of the small sample population used in the study, which amounted to a sample size of just 100 people. And there is also the reoccurring problem of replication, which we will cover shortly. There are several later iterations, one of which is the Hellman and Blackman Triad, popular in criminology classes. But the question is the syndrome valid? Can we actually predict future criminality by past behaviours? The evidence suggests not, and attempts to replicate Hellman and Blackman's findings were unsuccessful, and even John Macdonald himself later voiced doubt about the triad's validity after trying to test his own theory. Macdonald reported in his 1968 book, Homicidal Threats, that he could find no statistical significant association between homicide perpetrators and early problems with fire setting, cruelty to animals, and bedwetting. Yet the model persists. If you are ever unfortunate enough to be involved in a domestic dispute attended by police in the future, and you find yourself in the company of 2 or 3 burly and grimly determined police officers, and you happen to be male, consider this. When they're all tapping away at their smartphones, they won't be playing Candy Crush, but trying to establish whether you are a potential murderer or not. And what happens if you are unlucky enough to level up after all the boxes have been checked? What then? Another very real concern is the total lack of curiosity displayed by our politicians and bureaucrats relating to the motivation and source of the research they seem prepared to accept without question. It seems, if one mentions women and girls in a sentence, critical faculties evaporate almost entirely. But this is extremely damaging, particularly when it contradicts the findings of numerous well-researched academic studies. Karen Woodall, a well-known feminist author and researcher, observed the following regarding the gender-biased perspective of protective agencies and the consequences that follow. She wrote, and I quote, "How many of those same support services, I wonder, who willingly and blindly accept that the only issue to be concerned about around domestic violence is the safety of women and children, are aware that during the same period covered by the 29 Child Homicide Report, NSPCC research showed that some 800 children had died at the hands of resident mothers or carers? How many of these same support services that rely upon 29 child homicides to inform their thinking have read the 2000 publication Child Maltreatment in the UK, which showed that violent treatment was more likely to be meted out by female carers than male ones? So public policy has for decades been steered by a flawed feminist paradigm, which has proven itself impervious to data. Its tendrils have penetrated and influenced law enforcement strategies and government policies. And now feminism is on the cusp of introducing minority report style methodologies that seek to guide police and support services responsible for domestic abuse and violence, all the while ignoring real academic research and an extensive body of peer-reviewed literature. We end our adventure at this point. I hope you found something of interest in this video. If you would like to support my channel, I now have a Patreon page. If you're unable to support my work through Patreon, then you can share, like, or comment. It's all good. Thank you for watching.